think we are ready to begin. We'll begin. So welcome, everyone. So on behalf of the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures at the University of Virginia, a very warm welcome to our audiences across the US, Canada, and around the world. I'm Debjani Ganguly, the director of the Institute, and have great pleasure in welcoming you and our guest speaker, Professor Geoff Mann, to our year-long lecture series, Futurities. The series features and has featured humanists, scientists, writers, artists, and policymakers who explore existential questions about our unfolding futures in the age of technological immersion and climate change. We have so far hosted 4 speakers in this series: the South African literary historian Sarah Natal from Witwatersrand, who presented, her talk was based on inundation and overflow and waters taking over certain sites around the world. Our second speaker was Carlo Kadoff, medical anthropologist from King's College London, who spoke to us really right after the height of the pandemic and had his own take on what various kinds of modeling exercises to do with pandemics can tell us about risk in the future. Our third speaker was Amitav Ghosh, the renowned novelist and author of influential tracts on climate crisis, including The Great Derangement and The Nutmeg's Curse. And our speaker last month, Paul Edwards, he's the historian of science from Stanford and author of the path-breaking book, A Vast Machine, Computer Models, Climate Data, and the Politics of Global Warming. So Geoff Mann is our 5th speaker in the series. So as the world gets ready for the largest gathering of nations to address climate crisis this November, the COP27 meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, a recent UN report and other key studies appear to narrow our range of expected climate futures that previously swung between the extremes of normalcy and apocalypse. We appear to have traded one set of uncertainties about temperature rise for another about politics and the human response. We know a lot more now about how much warming to expect, which makes it more possible to engineer a response in some senses. And that response still begins with cutting emissions, but it is no longer reasonable to believe that it can end there. As David Wallace Wells writes in the New York Times today, a politics of decarbonization is evolving into a politics beyond decarbonization, incorporating matters of adaptation and finance and justice, among other issues. So if the fate of the world and the climate has long appeared to hinge on the project of decarbonization, a clearer path to 2 or 3 degrees of warming means that it also now depends on what is built on the other side, which is to say it depends on a new and more expansive climate politics. So the forthcoming Brazilian election and the fate of the Amazon forest is one example of this kind of expansive climate politics. As we all of us know, there is only one right candidate in Brazil currently for our climate future that depends fundamentally on the preservation of the Amazon. So our speaker today is uniquely situated to address the issue of climate politics. Geoff Mann is professor of human geography at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia. His teaching and research concern the politics and political economy of capitalism, and in recent years, increasingly in the context of climate politics. Geoff's work has developed along 2 general lines. The first is the historical development and future trajectory of macroeconomic governance, monetary, fiscal, and regulatory policy in the global north. He has explored the ways in which state attempts to address political, economic, and ecological crises, the policies it develops, the ideas and politics that shape those policies, and the historical and political economic conditions that make these ideas gain traction. And this is the focus of his 2017 book from Verso, In the Long Run, We Are All Dead: Keynesianism, Political Economy, and Revolution. The book examines the past, present, and future of Keynesianism and its origins and anxiety concerning the fate of civilization. From another angle, it is also the subject of a co-edited book, Money and Finance After the Crisis: Critical Thinking for Uncertain Times. This collection considers how we might rethink the role and meaning of money and finance in modern capitalism in light of the most recent run of crises. The second theme in Professor Mann's work, and also the subject of today's talk, is the political economy and politics of climate change. In 2018, he published a book with Joel Wainwright, Climate Leviathan, a political theory of our planetary future, and we will hear more about the book and his thoughts about it since today. Professor Mann is Senior Fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking and sits on the editorial and advisory boards of several influential journals, including Theory and Event and the Journal of Cultural Economy. At Simon Fraser University, he is associated with the Center for Global Political Economy, the School of International Studies. Professor Mann's essay on climate authoritarianism appeared in 2020. His talk today is entitled Climate Leviathan, a Political Theory of Our Planetary Future. Please welcome Professor Geoffrey Mann.
Thank you very much, Debjani. And thanks for the people doing the funny digital clapping. I really appreciate it. I'm very grateful to be here or there or whatever, wherever we are. I'm there with you. And I'm coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, who are, still here, and this is still their territory here in Vancouver. And I'm very grateful to have the chance to live here. The talk today is exactly as Debjani mentioned. It's actually, I'm just going to mostly go over the book, which I wrote with Joel. And I wish Joel was here, and I wish for you that Joel was here, because he's an exceptional scholar and a great person, and in my opinion, a lot better explaining some of this stuff than I am. But I'll be very glad to speak for us both. We do it a lot for each other. I'm going to share my screen, and then I will get going, if that works for people. Okay. Share screen. Here we go. How's that? Good? Okay. Does the slide look all right, or
it's
is
good?
It?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
We're good.
Mine has some stuff on top of it, but that's not a big deal. Okay, great. So thank you again. Thanks, Debjani, for inviting me. Thank you, Anne Gilliam, for helping me with the finances of this, because I always find it super tricky as a Canadian trying to deal with this. So I would really appreciate Anne's help. She made a huge difference in the smoothness of this process, as did Isabel. And thanks to Joe, too, who I just met. And also thanks to Joel. Of course, I do really want to flag how much of a collaborative effort this work is. So even though I'm, as I mentioned, the only one here, everything that I'm saying is, and probably most of the good parts, come from Joel. So anyway, we'll start with that. So in 2018, as a consequence of the Paris Agreement, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that many of you will know, the scientific body, published a special text outside of its typical assessment report process, the latest of which just appeared, examining the likely impacts of global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. I'm going to be telling you stuff that you already know, of course. And in this report, they model the greenhouse gas emissions pathways necessary to avoid exceeding this critical threshold. Even for those of us accustomed to the frightening updates from the environmental sciences, the so-called SR 1.5, Special Report 1.5, made for disturbing reading, noting that humans have already caused a 1 degree increase in the mean global temperature above pre-industrial levels. The IPCC observed that, here I'm quoting, warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052. Thus increasing risks to human health, livelihoods, food and water supply, and security, not to mention, of course, to all the other species on the planet. Even with only 1 degree of warming, we're already causing the 6th grade extinction, as you probably know. This starts with bad news. I apologize. It's going to be familiar, but bad news. To avoid overshooting this 1.5 degree threshold, the IPCC says, here I'm quoting again, global net anthropogenic CO2 emissions must decline by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 and must reach net zero by 2050. That was in 2018. This year, we received Assessment Report 6, AR6, which is, if anything, even more dire, and we are 4 years further down the road. The necessary course of action is obvious. To address planetary heating, we have to decarbonize the global economy immediately. This will be no small feat, since it requires a transformation not only in the world's energy system, but also in its fundamental political and economic, and indeed its material structure. So we find ourselves before the onset of drastic planetary change, changes likely to transform fundamental human relations to the Earth, relations evolving, of course, in ways that are mediated by our ongoing social relations. Now, at the risk of stating the obvious, and I apologize because I am probably stating the obvious to most of you, or maybe all, this planetary crisis, which is marked by, of course, rapid climate change, species extinction, and widespread but highly uneven suffering, this is also a political crisis. It sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but I really do feel like this doesn't come up often enough. We need to think hard about what we might call the place of our politics in the Earth's natural history at this moment. And at least in my experience, that is not an easy thing to do, even though it seems even more necessary every day and more daunting every day. So I forgot to change the slide, so I'm going to catch up with myself. But this is the slide that refers to the path we have to take to reach the 1.5, to have any hope of meeting the 1.5 threshold. And you can see this precipitous blue line that we need to follow to meet these stated objectives. Again, this comes up quite a few times in the talk, but you will all know that we are nowhere near doing this. So let's look quickly at a little bit of data, not much, I promise, mostly because it'll all be repetitive to you, and also because you'll be probably even more unsurprised than with the rest of the stuff. But let's look quickly at some of this data taken from ice cores here at the so-called Dome C site in Antarctica, where the reason this Dome C site is so important to climate studies is because glaciers have been forming there regularly, but haven't melted for millions of years, which has allowed scientists 800,000 years of continuous data on atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And as you can see, looking at the past, across the millennia, CO2 fluctuations have occurred within a particular band, about 180 to 280 parts per million. But this past June, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Mauna Loa Observatory, which is one of the key sites that measures parts per million CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, this past June measured 420 parts per million CO2, a level last seen, as you can see from this chart here, actually this part you can't see, 3.6 million years ago during the middle Pliocene. That's the last time concentrations were so high. And global mean temperature is presently 1.15 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It's warmer than it's been, as it says here, in 125,000 years. And in terms of atmospheric CO2 concentrations, there's nothing even close to it during the 300,000 years of Homo sapiens time on Earth. Now we know what we have to do. We have to stop moving carbon from the Earth's crust and putting it into the atmosphere. We must stop extracting and burning fossil fuels. But the problem, to paraphrase Naomi Klein, who also lives in Vancouver now, is that this means changing everything. Why? Well, to state something of the obvious, to start with, there's a correlation, a very clear correlation, as you can see here, between wealth and carbon emissions. The rich consume and pollute more than the poor, and this is true at every single geographical scale. So I'll just click through a couple of these. You can see this relationship. These are both log relationships. So those of you familiar with how charts work will know that if we drew this in a linear manner, it would be a sharp upward curve. This is global carbon inequality by income group. Of course, unsurprisingly to you probably, but the top 10% emit almost half of all the carbon in the world. And this is also true, of course, at the regional level. Look at North America, where it's quite stark. So the argument that Joel and I sort of, work with, of course, which the data completely supports, is that while there are, of course, exceptional individuals out there, capital as a class is destructive for the climate. And it has successfully squashed even the limited help that a global carbon tax might provide. In fact, has, of course, avoided taxes more generally. As you probably know, the billionaires of the United States pay on average 8.2% in income tax. This is a slide from last year of all the carbon taxes that are at work in the world right now. And it's worth noting that there are many subnational jurisdictions here. So there aren't that many carbon taxes. So for example, every single Canadian province is listed here, but it's really only one national carbon tax process. But you can see here, this is the carbon taxes that we have in place. The gray band is the minimum that is understood to be effective in terms of changing behavior. And most climate economists would put that gray band much higher than it is, all the way up perhaps to $200 per CO2 ton equivalent. Then this band runs between 40 and 80. So these are actually quite ineffective taxes, and even the highest of them don't come close to what many economists consider to be an effective level of taxing. Carbon taxes, of course, have many problems. Most are regressive. They're often designed to neutralize themselves by returning the revenues to consumers, who then actually often spend it on stuff that was worse than the original spending. And they also the accounting is easily manipulable, but they are nonetheless a means to internalize the costs of climate change, and thus to incentivize at least some changes to existing productive and distributive systems. But even this has so far been beyond the powers that be, as you know. In the face of this failure to address this fundamental inequality, even though it's not the only problem, those disinclined to radical systemic transformation often ask, can't we just change our energy supply? You hear this a lot, green growth. Perhaps we can maintain growth to which we are accustomed, as indeed capitalism requires if it's to continue working. It's an imperative. Can't we just continue to grow, but with clean energy? And many have been saying this, of course, for a very, very long time, basically since the 1970s. And also since that time, many have been promising that it was soon on its way, but it has never arrived. And the climate impacts of global energy have only gotten worse. Even if we look at something hopeful, I'm sorry to burst anyone's bubble, but thankfully, of course, in recent years, the amount of non-fossil fuel energy that's being used on the planet has been rapidly increasing. And you can see here the explosive growth of solar panel production in China is visible in these charts. Yet so too has total energy consumption. This is the crucial part. From a climate perspective, increasing the efficiency of clean energy, or even increasing its proportional contribution to the overall energy mix, is meaningless from a climate perspective if you do not reduce the absolute volume of fossil fuel burned, which we are nowhere near doing, as you can see. As we say glibly, you can drive to hell in a Tesla quite easily. You don't just need an F-150. Now, if we're going to get anywhere near the Paris goals, which is achieving that precipitous blue line you saw on the second slide, we're going to have to do more than subsidize solar and wind power. We have to realize the end of fossil fuel production and leave energy supplies in the ground. Even the IEA is saying this, and the IEA, who produced this data, is known for not being a radical hub of thought. Now, to state the obvious again, not using fossil fuels anymore is a radical demand, probably by definition. It will mean forcing the world's most powerful actors and their allies, which include massive, rich, and heavily militarized states, to give up some of the most valuable assets the world has ever known. A good historical analogy, perhaps, might be the great worldwide struggle against slavery and colonialism, which has made great strides, but victory is still far from complete, as most indigenous nations have experienced. And this has taken a very long time and involved an extraordinary amount of violence, and in fact, could yet be reversed. So even if it's an analogy, it's not necessarily one that perks your spirits. So what I would call the Wile E. Coyote politics of this moment, which is where we're off the edge of the cliff and running like crazy and not going anywhere, just hoping not to fall. The Wile E. Coyote politics of this moment is what got Joel and I on the track quite a long time ago, that led to our analysis of what we call climate Leviathan, to which I'll turn more specifically now. Now, like many of you probably, both Joel and I had long been involved in efforts to address these problems from a sort of what people call civil society perspective, going to demonstrations, talking to people, writing about it in popular press. But around the time of Copenhagen, the 15th COP, Council of Parties to the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the COP15 was in Copenhagen in 2009. COP27 is in Cairo this year. Around the Copenhagen meeting, we concluded that our political and theoretical approach to the problem of climate justice was beholden, in our view, to processes and commitments that increasingly appeared, for lack of a better word, useless, if not worse. So we decided to try and elaborate a theoretical framework that might, take us in a direction that made more sense to us. That project has been led by two burning questions. First, if we are to achieve a 45% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050, as I mentioned earlier, how in the world can we do that? What political processes would make that happen in anything resembling a just manner? So just asking straightforwardly, how is this going to happen, if it is going to happen? And if it's not going to happen, then we have to take that seriously, which I think we definitely do. If we do not achieve this, which we have to admit, of course, is a very real possibility. In fact, just yesterday, the UN announced that it thought that 1.5 was no longer achievable. And climate change reaches some threshold at which it's globally impossible to ignore. What are the likely political outcomes? So this is what I meant earlier when I said that this is a political problem, not just an ecological one. And part of the problem, in Joel's and my view, is that much of the progressive literature around dealing with climate change assumes that the political frameworks and political stabilities and political institutions with which we work now will persist into the future and allow us to continue basically with a similar kind of political structure that manages these increasing catastrophes, if you want to call it that. And our view is that it's ridiculous to imagine the persistence of our existing institutions in the face of the kinds of changes we're talking about here. And so what will those look like? What will politics look like? What will it mean to talk about political things in 50 years? I can't say I know, except I have a great deal of faith that how we talk about it now will be very different. So anyway, these are the two burning questions behind the whole project. Now, some believe that the elites, what we might call the global bourgeoisie, will effectively be able to wall themselves off from climate change. And this will mean that their politics won't adapt. And this is certainly what they're trying to do, but remain, as you might say, business as usual. Joel and I totally disagree. This is a photo from Oregon in 2017. It's terrifying, but funny. Of course, capital and the rest of those in power will not sit idly by as the fires encroach, though they may play golf. They'll try to, they tell us they'll try to flee these problems. We have people trying to get to Mars and building rockets for themselves. But the actual effort to get away from the planet is impossible. Instead, we have to take very seriously what I think those in power in the current system will do when they realize they are stuck down here with the rest of us. So if we return to the two burning questions, there's no plausible answer to either. I'll go back to it here for you. There's no plausible answer to either question that does not involve a comprehensive reorganization of human societies in the reasonably near term. We either deal with it and change everything, or we don't deal with it and change everything. As a species, humanity will almost certainly survive the coming centuries, but who will survive, how they will live, is genuinely uncertain, I think. The distribution of the burdens of substantial adaptation, which is now inevitable, whatever the extent of carbon mitigation from this point forward, and the political economic means of distribution, these are urgent issues facing us no matter what we choose to do. Now, our current efforts, again, stating the obvious, so I apologize for this. Our current efforts at addressing the unfolding calamities of climate change at the planetary or global scale have been, at least thus far, a virtually complete failure by virtually any measure. This is a map, a trend map of global emissions. Here are various gatherings to deal with the problem, and none of them have made even a single dent thus far. We could extend this to Cairo and the chart would look absolutely no different. At the heart of this problem, Joel and I argue, is, among other things, of course, the capitalist nation state that substantially structures our world. Every other form of formal political economic organization is irreducibly dependent upon it. It's almost impossible, probably for many of us, certainly for me, to imagine a world without capitalist nation states. Even those with pretensions to global scale power beyond the nation state usually assume that the nation state will be central to the efforts to achieve that power via the territorial or military political expansion of existing imperial nation states. However one chooses to date the origin of this capitalist nation state, whether we put it in the 1600s in Europe, wherever we want to put it, accelerating planetary climate change poses the greatest threat in its history. Unlike the other permanent emergency to which the organizational challenge of addressing climate change is frequently compared, the mobilization for World War II, the current threat is not to this or that nation state or to this or that transnational alliance. It is rather a threat to the sovereignty of the nation state everywhere as a means of organizing human collectivities. How those who exercise power today and the movements who challenge them respond to climate change will have an enormous influence on human life in the future. If we want to understand these processes, we're forced to speculate. And this is what Climate Leviathan is really about. It's about speculating how states and elites will attempt to shape warmer and weirder futures. And if we seek to ensure justice, democracy, and equitability in these futures, we have to consider how the current conjuncture might unfold in light of this analysis. So it's an inevitably speculative, often quite vague exercise, but one we feel is really important. So in Climate Leviathan, the book, Joel and I tried to imagine what futures would plausibly emerge from the current geopolitical order, guessing certain kinds of developments and then expanding in our imaginations where that might take us. Will the nation state-based zero-sum parceling of territorial sovereignty persist in the face of what is commonly described as the world's biggest collective action problem? Will the world remain in the thrall of capital? Even among the very rich, actually, the recklessness of endless accumulation and energy throughput that sort of characterizes contemporary capitalism is already beginning to seem not that wise. And as the author of the Stern Report, a famous report from 2006 on climate change from England, led by Nicholas Stern, a climate economist, as he put it, climate change must be regarded as market failure on the greatest scale the world has ever seen. Now, there's a lot to be done, and I have tried to do elsewhere, thinking through these frames of collective action problems and market failures. And if we want to talk about that afterwards, I think it's quite an interesting problem posed by contemporary economic analysis. But I'm not going to focus on it here. Now, this is the clunky 2x2 table that is at the heart of the book. I apologize, it looks like a grade 7 project, and perhaps it is. You be the judge after the talk is over. These two questions of sovereignty and of capitalism point toward what we think of as 4 very rough paths. These are almost heuristics. We call them Climate Leviathan, Climate Mao, Climate Behemoth, and Climate X, and you can see them here. And so if you are familiar with these kinds of charts, Climate Leviathan is an order that's committed both to capitalism and to planetary sovereignty. Climate Behemoth is one that's committed to capitalism, but is anti-planetary sovereignty, anti-globalist. Climate Mao is a planetary sovereign that is non-capitalist, and Climate X is anti-sovereign, anti-planetary sovereign, but also anti-capitalist. And I'm going to try and describe to you what we have in mind with each of these 4 potential future paths for the rest of the time that we're together. Now, I should begin by saying we don't think of these 4 paths as equally likely. We actually anticipate Climate Leviathan as being the most plausible and, in many people's eyes, perhaps the most preferable, for reasons similar, I think, to Frederick Jameson's famous line, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism," which actually, as a total aside, some of you may be interested in because this is such a famous quote, I learned just last week is actually not his quote. It's from a book review that he must have read from, I think, 1979 by an author who I hadn't heard of. And he adapted the quote without attribution, I guess we should say. But at any rate, he didn't coin the term, which I thought was quite interesting, given those of us who might be Jameson heads like myself. At any rate, we are already witnessing what Joel and I think of as Climate Leviathan emerge as common sense in much of the liberal capitalist part of the world. I'm not going to go through this slide. This is just an example of the kind of thinking that goes behind Climate Leviathan. Because Climate Leviathan is, as we understand it, a planetary mode of power organized around adaptation specifically, in an effort to perpetuate the current global distribution of power and wealth. It has on its side, and this is a great advantage, it has on its side the power of incumbency. This is already how for lack of a better term, how the world works. Along with, of course, political, economic, military, and ideological resources of the states and regimes that judge the existing order worth preserving, which are, unfortunately, those in power. The collective desperation that we see often within much of the progressive community in North America and Western Europe when we have the Conference of Parties, when we're hoping desperately for an effective treaty to emerge, this we understand as being part of the appeal of Climate Leviathan. Many of us, it seems to us, Joel and I, long for someone to determine how things are going to be, to set out an order for the existing world and its future trajectories that will preserve as much as possible what we understand, those of us privileged enough to enjoy it, is good about this world and allow for adaptation to a hotter and weirder future. Now, Climate Behemoth, which actually we didn't take as seriously as we probably should have when we were writing the book, also has an orientation to the capitalist status quo. But unlike Leviathan, it is vociferously anti-globalist. In other words, it is a capitalist order characterized by, and we see this across the planet today, a reactionary, usually racist, macho nationalism. Climate Behemoth today expresses itself most fiercely in climate denialism, but even that is diminishing quite quickly. A conspiracy mongering fear that an emergent, cryptically hegemonic climate Leviathan is the foremost globalist threat to nationalist capitalist ideal that animates much of, for example, the American Republican Party or the Conservative Party in the UK and Canada, actually here. We are no better. Now, Behemoth is a significant threat to global stability insofar as its current seats of power number among them the United States. When Joel and I finished the book in 2017, it was very soon after Trump had moved into the White House. And we were not, if we're honest, the book focuses on, to the extent that we pick an example of Climate Behemoth or a personification of Climate Behemoth, we chose Sarah Palin because we wrote the book prior to Trump's ascendancy. And we were not actually in a position we were not prepared for how well he would fit the Climate Behemoth role. But of course, similarly belligerent nationalist and reactionary blocs, often led by Trump sycophants, have captured executive power in a few other states in the global north and south, most notably Bolsonaro in Brazil, which of course, hopefully his rule will be over by the end of the weekend. That, of course, remains to be seen. Now, Trump and Bolsonaro are among the few world leaders to label climate change directly a hoax. Putin and the House of Saud have also occasionally expressed some skepticism around climate change. And there is not, we should say, an insignificant degree of support for similar posturing in some countries whose states acknowledge climate change, but don't really do anything about it. At the electoral level, this is particularly visible in the ascendance of local or subnational Trump wannabes, like, for example, Greg Abbott in Texas or Doug Ford in Ontario, which is Canada's, as you probably know, Canada's largest, most populous and wealthiest province. And we have our own Greg Abbott in charge there. Still, it seems fair to say that a big part of the reason Climate Behemoth seems so threatening today is attributable to its Americanism. Russia and Saudi Arabia's provocations have much to do with their relationship with the White House, one might argue, even in this complicated time. The largely white, male, sexist, and racist right wing with which Behemoth is associated in most of these countries, can wreak havoc even when it acknowledges that climate change is real. This is the part of the problem, is that Behemoth can persist even in the moment when denialism disappears. Here, this is the Poland's pavilion at the COP24 in Katowice in Poland. And maybe you've seen these pictures. This is all coal. Coal in the cages, coal underneath the person's feet. The whole pavilion was dedicated to the Polish coal industry at COP24. So Duda, the president of Poland, is acknowledging climate change insofar as he's hosting the 24th COP. But this is not how we're, at least Joel and I, hoping this will play out. He doubled down on coal at the meeting, derailed as much as he could the EU's decarbonization plan. And we can also see the same kind of thing happening with the FPO in Austria, which does not deny climate change at all, but actually just refuses to talk about it at all. Yet setting aside the real possibility that Trump might return to power, which of course is a whole other question that you're in a much better position to judge than I. The precarious electoral basis of the few existing climate behemoths, in our view, is still good reason to doubt its long-term endurance. This is not, of course, to counsel against resistance to these regimes. But as terrible and devastating as another Trump presidency would be, or as another Bolsonaro regime would be, we have to, at least I think in our, Joel's and my mind, acknowledge that the wheels are starting to come off the denialist bus. We have reached a tipping point, arguably, where there are so many clear signals of rapid environmental change that it's harder to confuse people by generating noise. And when even its own pandering media find themselves unable to sell a hoaxer story to Behemoth's constituency, for example, in the event of massive residential abandonment of coastal Florida, for example, or the collapse of the Oglala aquifer in the central part of the United States, those kinds of events, which are almost inevitable now, make it very difficult to imagine the persistence of a climate denialist regime. One of the least, of course, predictable, and again, you'll probably have a much better sense of this than I, one of the least predictable repercussions of Behemoth's declining legitimacy in the face of, undeniability, however, is the growing appeal of kind of Book of Revelations apocalypticism of a fundamentalist sort. The worldview of evangelical Christianity already does important reactionary work all over the world. The future impacts of its theological politics will depend not probably on the planet's climate, but on the right's capacity to conjure a kind of apocalyptic political climate. And that is I'm not in a position to judge the potentials for that, but I am in a position to be afraid of it. At present, though, an unquestioning commitment to capitalism contains the seeds of we would argue, climate behemoth's own destruction, because it's almost impossible to imagine the persistence of capitalism in a political economy that refuses to sharply reduce the burning of fossil fuels. Most of what we know about the social and ecological impacts of global warming is categorically bad for a mode of production that requires relative stability for the circulation and accumulation of capital. And we would argue, back to Climate Leviathan, that this is precisely why the World Bank and the IMF have come on so hard in favor of carbon taxes and a price on carbon. They understand the necessity of the persistence of the regime in the face of challenge to capital's very being. Now, to move to climate Mao, the inability of an atomized climate behemoth to address climate change-induced social and ecological transformation points us toward other Leviathan-like orders. But it must not be forgotten that although the wealth and power of the world are currently concentrated in the global north, people and mass political movements are concentrated in the global south. There is no reason to expect, for example, that in the face of climate devastation, the populations of South and East Asia will embrace a global climate Leviathan, for example, in the form it might take in the UNFCCC, or however those unfold over time, which insofar as the evidence we have thus far is only interested in maintaining the current global order in which those parts of the world are already substantially subordinated. As global warming further impoverishes, marginalizes, and literally kills billions of people in this part of the world, you can see here on this map of vulnerability, it seems unlikely to us that they will rally to a planetary order intended to maintain or even exacerbate existing global inequalities. Now, many of you in the room are probably more expert on many of these parts of the world than I, of course, but all these regions have their own political, economic, ideological, and cultural histories to draw upon, of course, many of which do not include the North American commitment to a regulative mythology of liberal capitalist progress. This is the reason why we give the name Climate Mao to the third future trajectory. It's a non-capitalist order of Leviathan-like planetary sovereignty. Now, I want to emphasize here, partly because I want to be careful that I don't overstep at all the limits of my own knowledge, which is quite constrained. To call it Climate Mao is not to say Climate China. although it is hard to imagine a scenario in which China does not play an important role in future global climate politics. Instead, we call it Climate Mao because we anticipate the potential for this future lies at least partly in the radical political traditions of South and East Asia, regions with historically significant rural collectivism that retain substantial contemporary organizational resources. Since this part of the world is home to literally billions of poor people, the vast majority of whom climate science indicates live in communities immediately at risk from climate-induced disturbance. Again, here's the map. There's more at-risk people in this part of the world than anywhere else on Earth. It seems reasonable to us to expect that these masses of people will draw upon their existing political and ideological traditions in the face of threats to their livelihoods and lives. Given that climate change threatens not only the internal stability of these regions, but the global political economy to which they are central, we anticipate Climate Mao would not embrace the nation state as a locus of sovereignty, at least not for long. Insofar as capitalism stands justifiably accused of driving both climate catastrophe and preventing serious action to address it, Climate Mao represents the most likely non-capitalist formation willing to confront Leviathan on the planetary stage. And this could, of course, at the roughest possible level of analysis, take the form of, conflict or at least complicated relationships unfolding over climate between China and India and the United States. Now, what's one of the more interesting things about these presentations over the years, and in the original article, which was actually written in 2013, is both Joel and I have experienced a sort of surprising embrace of Climate Mao amongst our radical listeners and readers. People often leave the room excited about the prospect of Climate Mao, which is not something that Joel and I feel, but it is interesting and it continues to strike us when we present this material. But it is clear to them, it seems to us, that the capitalist nation state has proven an irremediable obstacle to climate action, let alone anything approaching climate justice. And so the appeal of Climate Mao is almost visceral in this sense. Like Leviathan, it promises to get beyond the spatial and political limits of the state and to do something. But unlike Leviathan, in the eyes of many, it seems, it will not be beholden to the planet-eating capitalism that generated the problem in the first place, a condition that appears certain to guarantee Leviathan's inadequacy to the problem. And I think many of us, I would certainly speak for myself, of course I cannot speak for you, do have a sense that the current arrangements will never do enough. That there is no COP that will get us out of this process. We need more radical change. What that looks like, of course, is part of the problem here. Now, the final future to turn to, the final future political trajectory we describe, a future that refuses capitalism and sovereignty, both national and planetary, we call Climate X. Climate X is unfortunately, but inevitably, the most difficult for us to sketch out. Hence X. This is why we chose it. It's like a placeholding variable for a range of solutions. Climate X is our term for the world for which the global climate justice movement struggles, in all its diversity and multiplicity and hope. Because the movement is, in fact, many movements organized at many scales, X will take many, many forms. X is not one thing. Each little X shaped by its specific historical, geographical, and cultural conditions. But at a minimum, we would argue, these movements share two broad orientations. First, a rejection of the capitalist mode of political economic organization in which the problem of climate change originates. No remotely plausible capitalist basis for a just and secure future for all has been demonstrated in our eyes by anyone, despite decades of political maneuvering and greenspeak. Second, we would imagine the various X's at all scales, from the local to the national, to the subnational, to the global, would refuse to grant political priority, perhaps even status, to the sovereign arrogation of power, either in its national or emergent planetary form. The nation state has already demonstrated it cannot and will not save the planet. I don't have proof of this, of course, but to me, this is like something that I just feel like this is obvious at this point. The nation state is not going to save the planet. Climate Mao might, but it is about as likely to found climate justice as the original Maoism founded social justice. So if we're honest, I think we must acknowledge that both the nation state and its efforts at international coordination and enforcement have proven a hindrance to meaningful action. In the global north, the nation state has proven a massive compromise machine, a nominally democratic table at which capital always has the first and last word, and in fact gets to decide who's at the table. Climate X is a recognition of the solution to the climate crisis, if there is one, lies beyond sovereignty in multiple movements that organize not on the basis of predetermined autonomous political parcels, organized and ruled by others, but on the basis of struggles and livelihoods of those involved. Now, again, I'm stating the obvious here, but the multiple and centuries-long efforts of Indigenous people provide a useful and admirable teachings of organization and commitment and solidarity in the face, and political creativity in the face of these existential threats. These cannot exhaust the resources upon which Climate X will draw, but they are and will continue to be crucial sources of analysis, wisdom, and solidarity, as will the many other struggles of working people, racialized communities, and others on all scales. Some, but not all of these efforts will be based in a radical left tradition. That's the tradition from which Joel and I understand ourselves as having emerged, but we also understand that it is not the be-all and end-all of the future climate politics that we need. If Climate X is possible, we think it will only be possible through the post-sovereign solidarity of these many bases of climate justice. And I will stop there and thank you very much for your attention. I hope I haven't been going on too long.
Geoff, if you know, can I invite you to stop screen share? Then we can.
Oh yes, of course. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and we can just see our audience, and I'll just also. Yes. Well, thank you so much. I think we need certainly at least more clapped hands for you know, really prompting us to think and at so many levels. So thank you so much for that. For that very
thank you very much for having me. I hope.
And also being able to you know, we all come from different disciplines and we have different disciplinary orientations to similar narratives, but we also think with different models. And so I really truly appreciate the clarity.
Thank you.
Which
I appreciate it.
Gave us the picture. So Geoff's talk is open to questions. If you do have a question, please raise your electronic hand, or also feel free to post your comments on chat. Okay, so we have Kathy Wong, and it would be wonderful if you could introduce yourself, because not all of you are from Simon Fraser or University of Virginia. So do introduce yourself. Katie.
Hello, hi. I'm Katie, and I'm an undergrad student at the School of Architecture at UVA. And my question was that, as a person who is an American who lives in the global north, do you have any like perspectives of what our role is to play in climate justice?
Yeah, I'm always concerned in these situations. Well, so firstly, I'm not an American, just so you know.
Yes.
I'm Canadian. I did live in the States for about 10 years when I went to grad school and my first job. But so I have some familiarity with the American political context, but I've lived almost all my life in Canada. But at any rate, I do want to preface anything I might say here with the fact that while, you know, I'm lucky enough in some ways to have the chance to think hard about this stuff as part of my work, you know, and other people have to go out at the end of a long workday, you know, at the factory or in the hospital and fight for climate justice if they have the time and energy. Whereas, you know, I can supposedly make it part of my job. So it's an extremely privileged place to be. And I say all that to preface my response by saying there is no reason to believe that I know more about how to make a difference than anyone else who does this work. The fact that I'm a professor doesn't mean I have an insight into this. So I'm just giving you my personal take. But I do think, and I think Joel would agree if he were here, that part of the problem of the perspective of power that you're describing is that one tends to think that that one should have access to or needs to in some way access, the core of power. We have to speak to the people that matter, that will, that we're so used to being in charge of the world that we think that those are the vectors through which we can influence. But I would argue that, like our description, hopefully that was clear, of Climate X, actually the way we can make an enormous amount of difference is to focus on our communities, however we understand those communities. So that doesn't necessarily mean your neighbors or anything like that, though it could. But so, for example, here in British Columbia, over the years, for many good reasons, Indigenous people have come to the forefront of struggles over land and resources in this region. Here, I understand the most productive, if I could only do one thing, my most productive contribution to climate justice here in where I live is to support, speak with, if I can, to listen to the Indigenous peoples on whose land I reside, and who I desperately hope will regain control through this movement that here in Canada we call land back, of the land that I live on, so that they are making the decisions, because it's very clear to us that those in charge of the land right now are destroying it. But that's what I would do here, where you live, and the people that matter to you are going to be different, of course, and how you understand your community. But I do really feel like it's a turning, not down, of course, but a turning in of our efforts, as opposed to focusing on the COP, focusing on, UNFCCC. I feel like we have the resources to endorse the movements and the struggles of the people who are going to make the most difference. That's what I would say. Is this making any sense, Katie? I apologize. I was really long.
No, that made perfect sense. That was really a good answer.
Thanks. I wish I could see you. I can't see you, but
yeah,
thank you.
I just want to invite those of you who are okay with being seen to perhaps unlock your videos so that we could. Jeff has a sense of the audience, but it's fine if you just want to stay with your name on the screen. So Jeff, I just had a couple of comments, and one of them may be a question. In the way you imagined, sort of mapped South and Southeast Asia over broadly an emerging politics of possible, it's a speculation about non-capitalism with planetary sovereignty. Mm-hmm. For those of us who've had life worlds embedded in those parts of the world, even though we, not lived there for a very long time, it's really, and if you link that to the graph of the Great Acceleration as well, and carbon emissions, it's really the wholesale embrace of capitalist modes of living and a deep, deep belief in growth. Mm-hmm. To better their lives. And I find that deeply, deeply entrenched. I mean, I can't begin to talk of all of Southeast Asia, but certainly South Asia and much of Southeast Asia, actually, quite a few countries. I know less about China. So I am just curious about your conceptual mapping of the non-capitalist with planetary sovereignty and posing it in that part as a human geographer, putting it in that part of the world. Mm-hmm. This is just one question, and I just want to hear a little more about what prompted that. Is it the rise of communist regimes in China, Russia? So was that a model that is no longer really valuable? Because I really see capitalism deeply entrenched in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. So that's one question. And I also appreciated, how you said that, talked really about the dangers of apocalyptic climate political imaginaries. And at the same time, disaggregated the idea of speculative modes from thinking in apocalyptic ways. And here, my point of entry is really as a literary scholar and a cultural historian, because as a literary and also scholar of, to some extent, media, screen and media, because for a very, very long time, talking of genres of writing, the speculative genre has gone hand in hand with an apocalyptic mode. and what we are noticing in very interesting ways in these past 2 decades, certainly that I'm a novel studies scholar, so I read a lot of novels, that speculative mode in relation to climate change, that they've definite breaking away from that apocalyptic mode and more in the nature of a speculative realism, if one wants to call it. So they imagine futures 50 years from now, 100 years of now. And some of the really most powerful novels on the climate crisis of their time have been written by these writers who there is a speculation almost in the sense of the risk modeling, that kind of genre of speculation, but not linking it to apocalyptic scenarios, end of species, end of the planet, and so on. So I found that a really interesting point of connection with the way you've conceived of climate Leviathan, also in a speculative mode. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Debjani. So I'm a little reluctant to speak to speculative fiction, even though I do feel like the connections you're making are super interesting to me, and actually in a way that I find powerfully reinforcing. You're not the first person to say this. So for example, I was at a conference a few years ago on utopianism, and I wasn't talking about climate, but climate, of course, comes up. And I was speaking to scholars who were much more caught up in utopian literature, in the sort of Frederick Jameson tradition.
Yes.
And many of them were making very similar connections between the sort of political mode of speculative thought, the philosophical mode of speculative thought that sort of gets characterized most classically in Hegel, but it's very tough reading, and so most people flee from it. And then also the sort of more literary framing that you're describing, and there's definitely connections there to be made in a very, very interesting way, and perhaps they're already being made by folks like you. I just am unfamiliar with the literature. As for the opening comment, absolutely, this is if I'm honest with you, this is one of the toughest parts for me to retrospectively justify, in the sense that it's clear that capitalism has become crucial to. I don't have the knowledge to speak to modes of life on the ground for, if there is such a thing, the average citizen of India or the average citizen of China, which of course are probably fictions in themselves. But I would say that the centrality of growth and the centrality of capitalist being to contemporary Indian political economic organization, and the same, of course, in China in its own, specially characterized way, as they would say, are clear in ways that our analysis just does not take seriously enough yet. Mm-hmm. I should also preface this by saying, if I'm honest with you, that in the distribution of labor that was involved in writing the book, Climate Mao was definitely Joel's thing. Yeah. And he is much more knowledgeable about China in particular than I am, and has done a great deal of research there and in Korea. And so the sensitivities that would be required to really get at your question, I'm not sure I have them, if I'm honest with you. Though I would want to say that it does, there insofar as, and again, you would know this way better than me, at least for India, if not for China, as you said, the homogenous nature of the Chinese political economy as it's presented to us here in North America seems to me to be hard to believe. Do you know what I mean? That there isn't a great deal more internal conflict and possibility there in both good and bad ways, that we just don't get to see. And the fact that so many of those people still live rural lives is also very different than, say, North America and Europe. But again, I'm already stretching into territory in which, unwise, I should say.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. And one of the connections that I really forgot to make in all the way I rambled was that there are economists who have traced the link between the rise of carbon emissions and the decolonization of large parts of this world, because they kind of wholesale embraced capitalist technologies, coal, and even today, as you know, that Modi, who is not really in the climate behemoth mode because he's not a denier, and yet he is an autocrat. So he certainly has keeps emphasizing growth. His rhetoric is about, yes, we will do this, but we will also make your lives better. So there is no other imaginary that he puts to the public. So this is just it's an interesting thing to kind of connect the great acceleration with decolonization and the large-scale adoption of capitalism. But I can see a hand up there, Mohammed Al-Yousef. Mohammed?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
And I have my screen on also. So I'm Mohammed. I'm a first year PhD student at the politics department at UVA. And I have some, just like one of my main questions that came up to my mind while reading the book, Climate Leviathan, is that, and also from listening to you, Geoff, you said that in climate X, basically people are just gonna rebel somehow. The most vulnerable people are gonna rebel or overthrow their governments or change this current regime or something like that. But my question is that when you look at the most vulnerable communities that are direct victims of climate change, don't you think that it's kind of hard for them to climate change is not something they demand, it's not on their agenda. When you look at Puerto Ricans, people who have, I'm sure they've suffered from climate change. They have hurricanes every year. And their main priorities are maybe they want to put a roof on their top. They want to better infrastructure, better government resources, and some how do you think they would ever people who are vulnerable to climate change would ever kind of demand would ever overthrow their governments or do something radical just for the sake of climate change? I just don't get this. Sorry if did I make my question clear enough?
I think so. Yeah. Maybe you'll be able to tell from my response whether or not I understood the question. How's that? But I do think, actually, yes, I do. Though I wouldn't, and I don't think you would either, if I understand you correctly, disaggregate their responses, their demands, just like you're describing, for a stable roof over their head, or a workplace that is still there in the morning, these kinds of things. They may not understand those struggles directly as, and I don't mean to say that they don't understand in some kind of naive way. They may not directly relate those struggles to the struggle over climate justice, but that's what those struggles are, I would argue, always at the same time. In fact, it's not, and I guess I don't mean to say that therefore I understand what they're doing and they don't understand. What I'm trying to say, I guess, is that, and perhaps this isn't as clear in the book as we hoped it would be, that we understand the struggle for climate justice as being multi-dimensional. And there are struggles that aren't even directly over things we call environment, that are also struggles for climate justice, like the straightforward income inequality and the struggle for better redistributive systems around the distribution of revenues inside any community. We would still understand those things as being contributions to the struggle for climate justice. Now, whether or not, it's completely naive of me or Joel or anyone else to imagine those folks in Puerto Rico, rising up and taking over the state legislature and banning fossil fuels. I totally, agree with that, that would be a naive thing to expect. But I would also say that I don't think it's unreasonable to describe those other struggles as being caught up in a larger and more complicated set of politics. I think he's gone, isn't he?
Yes,
He didn't like my answer.
No, he Sometimes connections just fall out. Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't think there's anything you said that
that's okay.
you could object to, but
Even if it is, it's happened before.
not here. So yeah, I just invite the audience to join the conversation if you have anything to add, so that it's not just a conversation between Geoff and me. Yes, Blair.
Hi, yeah, I'm Blair Wilner. I'm a PhD in religious studies at UVA. And so my question for you is, I haven't had the chance to read the book. I have actually, our library doesn't have it, but I've asked them to order it. So,
Thank you.
soon. Yeah. Trying to help out,
Yeah. All the, just so you know, all the proceeds from the book, which aren't that extensive, as you could imagine, go to Grassroots International, which is a climate justice organization based out of New York, but does work internationally. So, what little royalties have arrived, they go there.
Oh, yeah, that's great to hear. Okay, so my question is, how would you sort of, or do you see sort of ways moving forward of sort of integrating the critique of capital or capitalism and the critique of sovereignty? I'm really interested in my own work. I have a chapter on sovereignty as a theological category, or sorry, sovereignty as a theological, ecological, and political category, but specifically looking at kind of like settler colonial deployments of sovereignty during in North America, kind of during the colonial moment, and then sort of looking at how that shapes how we think about land and place and space and so on and so forth. However, I don't often see sort of the sort of what we might call political economy critique of sovereignty. Like sovereignty usually is sort of like a critique of liberalism or critique of liberal political theory. But so I'd be interested in knowing how you might see ways, both sort of theoretically and then also like practically. What is a non-sovereign political movement, or what does a anti-capital, anti-sovereign political movement look like?
Well, in the broadest possible strokes, because I don't want to claim to exhaust what that might look like. I think that partly it's a function of the institutions that one understands as either that from which one is making demands, or as a sort of plain old geography problem around the scale of the struggle, if we can call it that. And I think if I can set aside the problem of anti-capitalism or non-capitalism, insofar as it seems to me that we're seeing an increasing multiplicity of movements that reject the sort of fundamental premises of straightforward growth, the kinds of inequitable distribution systems that we currently rely on. If we set that problem aside as something that we can already have a little bit of a handle on, then the anti-sovereign one, I think, is the kind of thing that you see, for example, it's the example that everyone pulls upon, so in some ways I feel a little bit kind of cheap doing it. But the work of Via Campesina, which has basically rejected the centrality of the nation state to these debates, is exemplary, whatever its complications. And I don't want to claim to be an expert on Via Campesina, though I do know some folks involved. I think, again, too, a bit of a cheap but also very instructive example is that of Indigenous peoples, especially here in Canada, where Indigenous politics, as you probably know, it sounds like it's a focus of some of your research, is much more central to what you might think of as the sort of national debate. Indigenous politics here is everyday front page news on the biggest newspapers and on television and on the radio. It is absolutely central, even in a bad way, to how the contemporary Canadian state and its sub-states understand itself. But it's also increasingly absolutely, as you probably also know, but maybe other folks don't, an explicit rejection there's explicit rejection on the part of Indigenous people. Like it's very common for me to talk to my Indigenous ally and friends here in Vancouver, and they would, without thinking, use the phrase, what you call Canada, to describe the country. Like that's how people talk here. This land of so-called Vancouver. Like that. So this seems to me, even in its very, what's the right word? I'm sure you English scholars know better than me. Even the sort of terminological politics, if that's a term, of how we debate things here is starting to unravel in a way that I think is that hints at the kind of anti-sovereign politics I'm trying to describe. I don't know if this is making any sense at all. Blair, but.
Makes sense to me, yeah, and I think those are the types of sources that I am interested in looking at too. So I think, yeah, it sounds like you and I are interested in the same direction.
Yeah, please get in touch. Actually, I mean, I may have folks here that you could enjoy talking with. Have you run into this book, Red Skin, White Masks?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Glenn lives just down the street, and he's a very frequent beer drinking friend of mine. And I can definitely put you in touch if you'd like to chat with him. He's a super amazing guy. He's actually just finishing up the draft of a book on the connections between Indigenous struggles and global Maoism.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Yeah, I will reach out for sure.
Yeah, Debjani has my email. Just send me an email.
Great.
Great. What a great conversation. So yeah, I'm sure there are many more questions about your Climate X box. There's just so much to think about there. But we have a question from Irui Gi.
Yes, hi, my name is Irui, and I'm a third year at UVA undergraduate. My major is political and social thought, double major in economics. Thank you for this great conversation. I really enjoyed it. My question is very general, because you talked about climate Mao in the presentation, and we discussed what China means as an authoritarian regime for global climate. I'm just as a undergraduate student who still has not gotten too much exposure to the field. I just wonder, how can we frame our questions in approaching, like, what does China mean to the global climate? If you can offer some perspectives, for example, global supply chain, like stuff like that, that would be very appreciated.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I'm going to preface this by, by saying that there's a very good chance that you know more about this than me, that everyone in the room knows more about this than me, in terms of the details. But China's status in global climate politics is, as I'm sure you're super familiar with, like everyone else in the room is, really complicated. The structure of the state as effectively an authoritarian state, as you said, has allowed for some what we might call remarkable achievements on the climate front, in terms of the capacity to exercise power in that direct and in less mediated way, has allowed the Chinese state to achieve specific, if necessarily localized, climate goals in a way that have proven much more difficult in the so-called liberal capitalist core of the world, where there's a lot more opportunity for debate and resistance. The fate of the skies of Beijing prior to the Olympics is a sort of classic example of the way in which that kind of authority can be exercised. But in terms of its status in the global political economy of climate and climate negotiation, that's been a much more uneven, as you know, experience, precisely for some of the reasons, I think, not only, but for some of the reasons that Debjani described when she was talking about India and the commitment to growth, the growth as a solution, both to ongoing poverty and other kinds of developmental issues or development issues, but also, of course, to at least the widely understood problem of kind of general political stability and delivering the goods. And insofar as that, the commitment to climate change to dealing with climate change involves a real challenge to growth, at least as we understand it. And I've been trying to think about this actually in some recent stuff I've been working on. You know, that poses real problems because I would say, this is aside from the climate Leviathan discussion in some senses, but, you know, there is zero evidence that we can grow our way out of this problem. Green growth is a mythology at this point. I'm open to being proven wrong. In fact, I would love to be proven wrong because the rest of my life would not have to change a bit. We just grow our way out of this problem. But that is I'll avoid swearing, but that is not going to happen anytime soon.
By mythology, do you mean that it's a vision that we have, but we do not know how to get there yet?
No, actually, I meant it. I used the wrong term. It's a lie. At least at this point. Yeah. So
would you mind elaborating more on why it is a lie at this point?
well, I mean, I won't go back to my slideshow, but I mean, just interested, actually, so tell me if I'm just like going off and not making any sense at all, because that's quite possible. It happens to me all the time. And students and friends have to jump in all the time and tell me I'm not making any sense. So you won't be the first, but so I have recently spent a considerable amount of time trying to understand the literature around so-called degrowth. Is this a term you're familiar with? Yeah, and so maybe you're all familiar with it. And degrowth, you know, is this idea that we cannot grow any longer. And one of the things, and so there's a whole variety of prescriptions as to how we might achieve this moment of degrowth, a kind of, you know, planned shrinkage of the global economy that would primarily for ecological reasons, for biodiversity and species loss, for climate change reasons, all these other things. And in principle, of course, I understand we are, you know, we are destroying the planet. And as far as I can tell, growth has, you know, been a big factor in that. This commitment to the sort of the imperative of growth that's built into capitalism has been a big part of the destructive force of modern life, modern human life on the planet. And I guess what I would say is that we're at the point now, in terms of at least the political economic experience, that growth no longer is should be the default conception of how we progress through this world. It is no longer justifiable. It now needs its own re-legitimization. And that's what I mean by it's a lie, because the advocates of growth have been promising us, the world, that it will deliver the goods for centuries. Firstly, in terms of the distributional problem, and now in terms of the environmental problem. And it's only getting worse. And I'm at this point now where I think to myself, even if the degrowth stuff sounds a little bit weird and sometimes kind of authoritarian, the burden of proof is now with advocates of growth, I would argue.
Advocacy growth.
The advocates of growth, those who claim growth is the way to go, they need to prove that to us now. And they have never done so. And that's what I meant by saying it's a lie. It's a lie thus far.
Get it. I actually think that a lot of folks on the economic side or the business side are very like hopeful about it, like using behavioral economics or finance and the incentive of money as a way to move forward. And there is a huge boom in concepts like ESG in business, and the recent Inflation Reduction Act is providing a lot of incentives. I guess that's a beam of hope to look at.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, your name is Yuri?
Yes.
Yuri. So my background's in economics. I'm trained as an economist. That's where I come from. And so, yeah, I'm super familiar with the models and assumptions that you're describing. But there's no evidence for them. Like at this point, there's still no evidence. And this is part of the thing I find fascinating about the climate economics literature, where I spend a lot of my time, unfortunately, because it's pretty boring. There's almost a willful refusal of looking history in the face. Like we don't have any evidence that any of this works thus far. But instead, we just pour resources into it in the hope that somehow it will soon deliver the goods, you know. But my thing is like, show us the money. If economics is the solution, show us the money. Show us one little thing that you can do that will make the climate better. Because I haven't seen one.
I think a particular interesting space that like demonstrate what you described is the carbon sequestration technology that so many oil companies are investing, like heavily investing in, and it's not a proven technology, but people have a huge belief in it, especially for those oil companies.
We just had a massive giveaway here in Canada too, just like you did in the US around CCS, mostly to oil companies. No evidence it'll work. And that's assuming that the technology is workable, let alone scalar problems.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And so, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much.
no problem. Nice to meet you.
Speaking of the heavily investing, and I think I can relate to the previous question about China at one point, is the electric vehicle industry. So recently, the EV industry in China has dropped a lot, although previously it was really booming in terms of the stock prices. And that's partly because the government is really heavily subsidizing the industry. And it's the same case for like solar panels, other clean energy technologies. China has become the #1 supplier of solar panels for the world. And behind it is definitely the government subsidy that comes from the authoritarian regime. But at the same time, it's probably not a sustainable growth strategy either.
So Geoff, I am aware that we are coming to the end of our kind of session. So do you want to have a brief response about EVs, or just a few words at the end?
Yeah. Well, I don't have. I mean, if someone, I don't really have anything specific that I wanted to say other than thanks very much to everyone, and thanks for engaging with the conversation. It's been really nice to see people's faces, and those of us who teach spend a lot of time staring at screens with just names on them. And so it's really nice to see people's face and to, talk with people from undergrad and PhD and UW Johnny, senior scholars. I just feel very fortunate to have been invited.
Well, we thank you so much. We've learned a lot in this 1.5 hours. So please join me in thanking Geoff for just a marvelous talk. And I really hope we have some other opportunity to continue the conversation.
That'd be great. I've never been to Virginia, but
that'll be great.
Maybe one day.
And we have some robust initiatives in climate. It's one of our great research flanks at the university. So
that's great.
So hopefully we'll have another opportunity to continue this conversation. But
That
thank you
so
much.
Thank you.
So
Thank
much.
you all.
And thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No problem, Katie. Thank you. Thanks for your question or comment or whatever you want to call it.